Edwin H. Porter was born either 1863 or 1864 in Metcalfe County, Kentucky. We don't know the exact year for certain because birth records during the Civil War in that part of the country were not kept. As the archivist for Metcalfe County told me, they were kind of busy back then doing other things. Porter is known to us as a crime reporter for the Fall River Daily Globe, a job he started at the end of 1890, and he covered the Borden case exclusively. He was in the Borden house the day of the murders and talked to several of the key players. He was named as being one of the persons crowding the stairway in the jailhouse in Fall River the day Lizzie was supposed to have told her sister Emma, "You have given me away." While he was never called as a witness, his name appears in the trial transcript 12 times. His book, The Fall River Tragedy, A History of the Borden Murders, privately published after Lizzie's acquittal in 1893 and sold by subscription for $1.50, holds the distinction of being the first book written on the case. Porter was only 30 years old. Sadly, he died of tuberculosis in 1904 at the age of 39, leaving a wife aged 34 and 2 daughters ages 12 and 5. A more in-depth biography of Porter and the sad story of his family is contained in the companion film to this one, entitled A Headstone for Edwin H. Porter. I invite you to watch it. This episode of Mondo Lizzie, however, is about myth-busting, another golden oldie, and one that I continue to hear as fact to this day. You know it, I'm sure, and may even believe it yourself. It's the legend that the rarity of Edwin Porter's book, The Fall River Tragedy, is solely because Lizzie Borden bought up the run of the publication and had it destroyed. Did she or didn't she? In this case, she didn't. How do these stories get started? Who first writes this fiction, and then who repeats it so that it becomes like fact? It's a long journey, I'm afraid, and many notable authors are to blame for not only replicating the myth, but embellishing the details and sensationalizing the story. Before we look at who started this, let's read a tiny bit about where the later confusion may have originated, or shall I say, transmogrified into balderdash. The world and Lizzie Borden knew that Edwin Porter was writing a book on the Borden murders well before the trial of Lizzie Borden began in June of 1893. 3 articles appeared in newspapers at the end of January 1893 that informed the public that a book was in the works, but that the Bordens had a problem with it and instructed their lawyer, Andrew Jennings, to contact the author and insist on a few restrictions or there would be dire legal consequences for Porter and his publisher. The Fall River Daily Evening News was the first to report that legal notice was served to Porter and the printing house of John D. Monroe by attorney Andrew J. Jennings on behalf of Lizzie A. Borden. He advised Porter and Monroe that they would be directly accountable for all statements contained within the forthcoming book, and for any false statements or colorable description, they would be promptly prosecuted. The notice also ordered that Porter and Monroe were forbidden to publish any photographs of Andrew J. Borden, his daughters, John V. Morse, or any of the defense attorneys. All of these images were to appear in Porter's book, which for the first time was going to present photographs, as opposed to newspaper illustrations, of all the main characters as well as the death scenes. Of note, the name Abby D. Borden was not among those on the list of individuals whose pictures were verboten. The concessions made between Porter and Jennings finally were the exclusion of images of Lizzie, Emma, and their uncle John V. Morse in the final publication, but the inclusion of the dead. The next day, the Boston Evening Transcript reported the shortened version of the same story, and the Boston Post followed suit. Interestingly, nothing appears on the story in Porter's own paper, the Fall River Daily Globe. No other articles appear around this issue in the months preceding or following the trial, before the publication of the book, or afterwards. Porter had 47 images and 3 ground plans of the house in his book. We see the police, the prosecution, Bridget Sullivan, those who testified, even the death photos that were taken around 3:30 that afternoon, but no Lizzie, Emma, Morse, or defense team. Some of the photos are wow images. Abby as a younger woman, the arrival of Lizzie at the Fall River police station, the Borden homestead on Ferry Street, the Central Police Station, the Taunton jail where Lizzie was housed during her wait for the trial, and the grand jury. The book was published in August, just 2 months after Lizzie's acquittal, and no legal action was taken by her or on her behalf. Besides a little self-published study in logical fallacies in 1893 called The Mystery Unveiled by Todd Lunday, a pseudonym for the Reverend Silas Daniel Harp, then living in Rehoboth, Massachusetts, and the pastor of the Rehoboth Congregational Church there was not another book published about the case for 21 years. The Mystery Unveiled is an analytical analysis of the murders, arguing that if Lizzie didn't do it, then no one did. It is a short book and well worth your time to read it. You can download a free digital copy on my website, lizzieandrewborden.com. By the way, this book is the rarest of Borden books. I have never, ever seen an original copy come up for sale anywhere. So back to the myth. Where does such a story that Lizzie had all the copies destroyed upon publication come from? Let's start in 1924, shall we? Edmund Lester Pearson, a librarian at the New York Public Library, wrote a little classic book called Studies in Murder. In it, among other tales of murder and mystery, was one called The Borden Case. In his appendix in the book, he writes, quite out of the blue, "This book is out of print and is generally supposed to have been suppressed. In Fall River, it seems to be on the Index Librorum Prohibitum. It is mentioned in hushed tones and is not included in the catalogue of the public library." Suppressed. That word means put an end to. Was he referring to the publication being suppressed or libraries deciding not to carry it? This is unclear. We know that copies were at the Library of Congress, and people did buy the book, as is evidenced by the subscription books that are held at the Fall River Historical Society and in private collections. But his choice of the word suppressed seems to be the seed. Every other author who mentions their attempts to get their hands on a copy makes this a bigger and bigger thing. Odder still, Pearson was able to read the Fall River tragedy at the time he wrote his story and quotes from it in his correspondence with Frank Warren Knowlton, Hosea's son. He writes that his friend, the Scottish murder writer and lawyer William Ruffhead, asked Pearson for a copy for his collection, and he was able to oblige him. Not so suppressed after all. Then another 33 years go by, and Miss Victoria Lincoln, Fall River native and fiction writer, pens A Private Disgrace, Lizzie Borden by Daylight. It becomes a bestseller. Here we get to the crux of the matter. On page 27 to 28, she writes, "Like most of Fall River, I had always wanted to read Edwin H. Porter's The Fall River Tragedy. However, Lizzie bought off the printer, a local, and the books destroyed before they hit the shops. There was no cheaper way to handle it, for the work was not actionable. It expressed no opinions and gave no damaging information that had not already appeared in out-of-town newspapers. I may be wrong, but I think that Lizzie acted on the advice of Mr. Jennings, and that was about the last advice he ever gave her. I wish there were more, for I should like to recommend it. It has the very smell and texture of the first world I can remember. Mr. Jennings had reason not to want Mr. Porter's book lying about in the awful durability of hardcovers. It contained just enough of Lizzie's inquest testimony to make one want to read more, and from that testimony one can learn just what specific fact the Bordens made Bridget was paid not to tell. Mr. Jennings need not have worried. What must have looked so obvious to him was hidden in a sea of sand, for the full inquest is too smotheringly dull for any uninitiated eye to bother with it. Furthermore, no possessor of the initiated eye would have made him trouble. The whole town liked and respected Andrew Jennings." And just in case you missed it in the earlier part of the book, on page 304, she repeats, "The town was further irked when Lizzie bought up the Fall River tragedy and nobody had a chance to read it. Everyone wanted to. As I told you at the start of our story, I had to wait for the pleasure 40 years before I found the first copy that I had ever seen in the Library of Congress." And because she's from Lizzie's Fall River and she grew up nearby and her family was old Fall River family and she claims a connection to Lizzie even though they never met or hung out, people believed her. And other writers believed her. And you believed her and we all believed her. And it was poppycock. And not the delicious kind. The following year, Edwin Porter's book, Lizzie Borden, The Untold Story, was published. He was a bit more circumspect and didn't blame Lizzie at all, but still assumed a great deal when on page 16 he wrote, "The Fall River Tragedy by Edwin H. Porter, a Fall River police reporter who stoutly defended Fall River police for arresting Lizzie Borden. This book, published in Fall River, had a limited sale and circulation." That same year, 1968, Agnes DeMille, the great choreographer and creator of the ballet Fall River Legend, published her book, Lizzie Borden, Dance of Death. Half the book's about the case and her visit to Fall River to get the lowdown from those still alive, and half was on the production of the ballet. Anyway, on page 125, after apparently reading Pearson, she uses that word, but this time makes it all of Lizzie's doing. Noted in the newspaper accounts of the time and the Porter book, which Lizzie tried to suppress and then bought up and destroyed. There were no newspaper accounts of this act. She must have been referring to the legal wranglings we discussed before between Porter and Attorney Jennings, which were amicably resolved, but now the die was cast. 6 years later, in 1974, Robert Sullivan, a man who should know better because he's a lawyer and a judge by profession, wrote this in his book, Goodbye Lizzie Borden, on page 142. In his book, Porter naturally devotes considerable space to Mrs. Reagan's testimony, since he himself played a major role in its earlier dissemination to the press. Apropos Porter's book, it is said that, when published after the trial, virtually all copies were purchased and destroyed by Lizzie Borden. So far as I've been able to determine, only 3 copies now exist, one of these being in my temporary custody at this writing. Only 3 copies, huh? Not hardly. Book dealers will tell you that isn't so. And back then, one such book dealer told a friend of mine that he had some 20 copies pass through his hands while he was in business in the 1970s. And that's only one dealer's story. But keeping it rare is really good for business. It keeps the prices up when one comes up for sale, don't you know? In 1980, Joyce Williams, in her book, Lizzie Borden, A Case Book of Family and Crime in the 1890s, co-authored with J. Eric Smithburn and M. Jean Peterson, includes this gem in the back under further reading. The fact that Lizzie bought all the copies she could find suggests that she thought so too. Here she's referring to her earlier comment that the book makes a devastating case for Lizzie's guilt. Only a few copies escaped her net. One is in the Library of Congress and the other is in the Fall River Public Library. Are you beginning to see a pattern? And then the next 2 men come forth and seal the deal, forever cementing in people's minds that Lizzie had them destroyed. In 1984, the worst book on the Borden case was published by Frank Spearing. He made up so much stuff in this book, it reads like fiction. Anyway, on page 36, he writes this in a footnote. Only 4 copies are known to exist. A copy that was originally in the Library of Congress has vanished. One is kept at the State House of Boston. One is in the archives of the Fall River Historical Society, and one is in my possession. Lizzie bought off the printer and had all the other copies destroyed before they reached the bookshops. Magically, there are now 4 copies in existence, one more than Judge Sullivan states. But the worst falsifier of record in this tale is none other than Robert Flynn, the man who reprinted the Fall River tragedy when it came into the public domain. He made the book widely available, and for that we are grateful. He said he was limiting his publication of the exact reprint of Porter's book to 1,000 signed copies, but when that sold out, he simply printed more. So your extra special one-of-a-kind limited edition signed copy is really worth just about the same as any other, around $24.95. And I think that may be why he was so all in on the Lizzie got rid of them idea. If you wanted to read Edwin Porter's book, you had to buy Flynn's reproduction. In the foreword, he writes, Lizzie Borden prevented its circulation by buying out and destroying the entire edition. Just how many copies survived the book's suppression in 1893 is as much a mystery as the Borden case itself. Victoria Lincoln and Robert Sullivan both indicated in their books that only 3 copies existed. Williams, Smithburn, and Peterson believed only 2 copies existed. Most other books on the subject make reference to the book's suppression and its extreme rarity. Oh my, and how sad. Since these other authors said it, it must be true. But not to be outdone, in 1991, the conspiracy theorist and he of the illegitimate son did it theory, Arnold Brown, wrote this on pages 89 and 90. It's not known how many copies of the Fall River tragedy were printed, but it had to be several hundred, if not several thousand. 50 years ago, only 2 copies were known to exist, and one other was rumored. The overwhelming majority of the press run simply disappeared the day it was published. Miss Lizzie, the legend says, acting on the advice of Andrew Jennings, bought up and destroyed every copy she could. If Lizzie did not do that, someone did. Porter himself, like almost everyone else connected with the case, dropped from sight. We assume that he was paid to disappear, just as the legend says Bridget Sullivan was. Like Bridget, he played the game honorably. He could have gone elsewhere and republished his book, but he did not. Porter was an outstanding reporter, and yet after 1893, there are no reported bylines from anywhere in the country. He simply was never heard from again. He goes this extra step, you see, to make it sound oh so mysterious. Porter disappeared after the printing and was never heard from again. No, actually, according to the Fall River City Directory, in 1903, Porter was still writing for the Fall River Daily Globe and the Boston Herald. And no, actually, it's just that he died in 1904. Maybe a little research could have assisted Mr. Brown, another native of the city of Fall River, by the way, but sadly no. He takes the story, adds a new twist, and just rolls it out there for you to go, OMG, this is bad, Lizzie, bad. It's like he's insinuating that Lizzie had him bumped off or something. But we're not done. In 1992, Robert Flynn's good friend David Kent published 40 Wax. In the front matter of the book, he repeats the myth, adds a new twist, and then promotes Flynn's reprint. Knowledge of what Porter had done was unwittingly obscured when Lizzie, learning of the publication, was rumored to have bought up all but 25 subscription copies and had them destroyed. Thus, only a few saw what Porter had written and were unaware of his distortions. But scholars ferreted out the half-dozen copies held in public libraries and other institutions, and these became the source books for all research. Fortunately for historians, Porter's book was rescued from limbo and reprinted by the King Philip Publishing Company of Portland, Maine. So what's the true story? Let's turn to pages 527 and 528 of Parallel Lives, A Social History of Lizzie A. Borden and Her Fall River by Michael Martins and Dennis Bennett, curator and assistant curator of the Fall River Historical Society, published in 2011. On January 13th, 1893, The title was registered with the Library of Congress. There, inscribed in an old ledger in a florid hand under registration number 2968Y, was written, "The Fall River Tragedy, A History of the Borden Murder by Edwin H. Porter, George R. H. Buffington, Fall River, Mass." Beneath the entry, recorded just short of 8 months later, was the notation that 2 copies of the publication were deposited in the library on August 10, 1893. The volume was sold at least partly by subscription, as is evidenced by the 2 extant salesman's sample editions having belonged to the publisher and the author, reflecting the orders for the book in advance of its release. The broad scope of interest in the case is apparent in the diversity of individuals whose names appear listed. The myth that Lizzie A. Borden managed to intercept distribution of this potentially scandalous read is all but disproved by evidence that exists to the contrary. As a subscribed publication, it was anxiously awaited by those who had paid the requisite fee of $1.50 to ensure that they received a copy. Individuals associated with the case, such as Mrs. George S. Brigham, Andrew J. Jennings, and Anna H. and Carrie L. Borden, purchased the volume in order to discover what it contained. The book also found its way into the libraries of many of Fall River's leading families on the Hill. The quantity of copies known to exist stands to indicate that even if Lizzie had attempted this gesture, she was not successful in acquiring the entire publication run and having it destroyed. Ta-da! Well, there you have it, another myth busted. Oh, you say this film made you hungry for a copy of an original Porter? Well, they're certainly out there. Here are a few sales pages I found recently, all from different sellers. The price range is very wide, but the difference is really based on condition. And because this book was read by people, it didn't necessarily physically hold up with time. You will see more of them for sale as the years pass, and one day you too can add to your collection an original Porter. Speaking of Porter, we are raising money to put a stone on his grave. He is buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery in Fall River with one of his daughters, and the grave is unmarked. To that end, we have started a GoFundMe page. We need to raise $2,800. Please help however you can. Thank you, sincerely. Edwin H. Porter deserves it. And please watch the companion film on Porter and his family and the fundraising effort. Until next time.